And today I want to talk about something called a legal state. And what I want to tell you about the legal state has to do with it being a legal statement. And what is a legal statement? It's important to know what the legal state is because everything in our government, in my opinion, is referenced the legal state. A legal state that was created by the Constitution and by Lincoln and by the Congress and all the things that it does. So legal state is similar to legal statement. A legal statement is a man-made statement, or appears to be a man-made statement, such as in the American Encyclopedic Dictionary. So these definitions are not always easy to figure out. Okay, so if we read legal in the American Dictionary, this is an encyclopedic dictionary. An encyclopedic dictionary means that it has a word in all of its use. So in all subjects and in all grammatical forms. You can find a dictionary that has just a certain topic and how words apply to that specific topic. So if you go to a biological research institute library, you're going to find dictionaries that have words as pertains to biology. If you go to a college of chemistry, you're going to find a lot of dictionaries where the words pertain to chemistry. And if you go to a law library, you'll find a lot of dictionaries where the words apply only to law. And I have more on that we'll talk about maybe in another video. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I've heard some people say that there's a conspiracy to change the meaning of words. You can't really change the meaning of words because words are put together in a very specific way. Now there's words that are undefined in like the legal system, or words that maybe are new to the biological system, but they're still put together in a certain way. So it's not my opinion that there's a conspiracy to change the definition of words, but in the legal sphere, you have words that come into use and they're adjudicated on. So the justice or the judges write opinions, and they may use the word in a different way or define the word, actually defining the word for the first time. So there's a lot of stuff that's written, but you can't find a definition for that word or that phrase because it's not defined. But it's put together by someone according to the laws or the rules on how words are put together: prefix, root word, and suffix, and then what language did the root word come from. And sometimes people mix prefixes and suffixes with different language. So then someone will write a paper on it or come to a definite meaning on it, and then those are put into the dictionaries. So when you look at an older dictionary and the word's not there, and then you look at a newer dictionary and there's the word, or the word was used in a different way and then it's used in a new way, people think that there's a conspiracy to change the definition of words, whereas it's just the word's been being used in a different way. And usually in law dictionaries, there's case law that shows how the word was used. So it's not really, it kind of is and it kind of isn't. So it's not like that there is a conspiracy to change the definition of words, and it's not really that there's not a change or that the words don't change. I don't think that there's really a conspiracy to change the definition of words, but sometimes words are used in a new sense. So this is an encyclopedic dictionary. So it says as an adjective, in ordinary language, in theology, okay, as a substantive, and then in Scots law. So it shows all different ways that it knows to define the word in the way it was mean, because it's an encyclopedic dictionary. Now, if you go to a regular dictionary, like a law dictionary, it's only going to give you the legal meanings, and then it'll have like a case law to back it up. Okay, so from French, legal, from Latin, legalis, legal from lex, legis, legal, legale. Okay, so these are different languages. As adjective, ordinary language, according to law. Okay, so when it says law, it's talking about God's law. It's talking about nature. It's talking about the laws that we don't have any control over. So legal is really man-made, and then law is natural law, things that we can't change. And anything legal is supposed to be, and this is written in a ton of different places and even defined in this way in almost every single instance, that it's according to law. Why do they say that? Because man makes law, and when man makes law, he's making something that's legal. It's artificial, it's fictional. Even though it's real, it's not true. True laws are only God's law. Even though God's laws are real and man's laws are real, only God's laws are true. Okay, and that's written about in some philosophies of law, some philosophy books on law. Okay, so anything man-made is supposed to be in harmony with the natural law, because if it's not, then men are trying to get other men to do things against their human nature. And the maxim of law that backs this up is that man cannot be compelled to do something that is impossible. So the founders wrote that it's impossible in the Declaration of Independence for a man to give up his rights. That certain of them he can't give up at all. They're called unalienable or inalienable rights. They're part of his humanity. He can't give them up. So when the legal system, which is man's laws, tries to make laws not in harmony with natural law, he's trying to compel man to do something that's by force or against his will or against his nature or against nature in general. And man can never be compelled to do something that's impossible. So in accordance or conformity with the law. Okay, so the law is God's law, the law. It's therefore lawful. When it's in harmony with the law, it's lawful, legitimate, it's permitted or sanctioned by the law, God's law. Okay, now in the Constitution, law is always written with a capital L, just like the word God, or when you're referencing God and you say he, they're capitalized. Okay, specifically, we're talking about that law. The lender will rather lend it to the banker at the legal interest. So the interest set by men, okay, but legal interest still has to be lawful, meaning it can't be exorbitant or exaggerated or over the top, too much. Okay, you could even ask, is it even possible to have a legal interest, because the law doesn't establish any kind of interest. Okay, now there's some things written by men that they claim are according to God's dictates, which you might find in the Bible, but the Bible wasn't actually written by God. It's still a legal system, because they're still written by men. Okay, so created or defined by the law as a legal crime. Okay, it's not a crime against God's laws. It's a legal crime pertaining to law or questions of law. An officer was able to determine all legal controversies which could occur within the district. In theology, okay, of or belonging to the Mosaic law, conformable to the enactments of the Mosaic law. So Mosaic law is Moses' law, the Ten Commandments, and those are man's idea of what God wants, of what God's laws are. Now, we don't have to agree on those things. They say, thou shalt not steal is one of the Ten Commandments. I don't always agree. I think in general, yeah, thou shalt not steal. But when a man is starving to death or he's watching his children starve to death, I think he's entitled to steal. If he asks for food and he's not fed, or his children are not fed, a man is supposed to defend his family. And if he has to steal to keep them alive, then how do you punish a man who's stealing when he's stealing not for purposes of enriching himself, but just for staying alive? Now, I'm not saying that stealing in that instance is still right. We should take care of each other and not have to steal. However, sometimes things happen and you have to take something. Again, I'm not saying that stealing is right, but to feed your family, it's kind of like one of those things that's just it's on the fence, you know. You can go one way or the other, and it just depends on your circumstances and your what your intention is. You know, if your intention is just to feed your family, then you had no choice. So, of or belonging to the law, okay, the law as distinguished from the gospel, of or belonging to works as distinguished from free grace, Scott's law, the same as legal reversion. Okay, so legal debts are the debts that man has subscribed to and made law and written down and you agreed to. So legal things are man-made. They're supposed to be in harmony with the law. They're artificial. They're fictional, real, but not necessarily true, because true is God's law, the law. And a legal state would be a legal statement to make known among men, to state it, to write it down. A written statement such as a constitution, an acknowledgement, an acceptance of the legal statement. The man-made state such as bills, an application, like an application for benefits, an application for a birth certificate or a driver's license or other licenses, an application to pay a tax. These are all part of the legal state, man-made state. Okay, these are statements in the legal system, in the man-made system. Okay, and we talk about Mosaic laws. Okay, Mosaic laws were a legal state because they were man's opinion of God's laws. That's why it's called theology. And use as an example in American Dictionary under legal, which that's this, to legalize or to sanction. You sanction something in writing. A will, they prefer it in handwriting because it's said that if it's in handwriting, it's of the highest law, right? Because it's holographic or holographic. It's as if you said it when you write it by hand. So the Constitution is in handwriting, and it's as if it were said. And here, let's try to move this. Move this up so you can see it. Legal fiction is a fiction. Legal reversion, such as what we saw here, legal reversion in Scots law, the period within which a debtor whose heritage has been adjudged is entitled to redeem the subject, that is, to encumber it of the adjudication by paying the debt adjudged for, called also legal. Legal tender, it's legal money, man-made money. Supposed to be in accordance with the law, meaning it's supposed to be gold and silver because gold and silver comes from the earth. And then man legalizes it by putting a printing on it, by minting it. Okay, so the Constitution requires for specie, which is gold and silver, and then minted. And when it's minted, it's legal tender. This other stuff that we have has nothing to do with, this fiat currency has nothing to do with anything. Okay, so now we need to go and look at Lincoln's legal state. Lincoln created a legal state during the Civil War when the states tried to secede from the Union. And he didn't allow it. He said, no, we're going to stay here and we're going to force ourselves back into your state, because what happened was the states tried to secede from the Union, and when they did that, they kicked out the federal government. They kicked the federal government out of their state, meaning they no longer had a constitution, a federal constitution. The federal constitution allows for the federal government to operate on federal lands inside the state, but when the state seceded from the Union, when it ceded its natural state, naturally created state from the Union, it kicked out the legal state. The legal state is the state created by the federal government for military purposes. And it was operating only on those lands inside the state. So when the state ceded from the Union, it kicked it out. And then Congress came back and said, well, we don't have a legal state inside these 7 states that ceded from the Union. And they forced themselves, using military authority, back into the states. So even though the states ceded from the Union, and it was their right to cede from the Union, and they ceded the way they were supposed to, and there was nothing wrong with them ceding from the Union, the federal government came and used military force to force itself back into those states. But what it says is not always how things actually are, because they're not going to tell you we did this unlawfully. They're not going to tell you they did it dishonestly. They're not going to tell you all the ways that, all the reasons why they shouldn't have done it or didn't have authority to do it. Because the states are always sovereign to the federal government. And then the federal government is sovereign to its military areas and its seat of government. So in July 19th, 1867, in the House of Representatives, a single contradiction is apparent here. Congress declares those local state governments to be illegal governments, and then provides that these illegal governments shall be carried on by federal officers who are to perform the very duties imposed on its own officers by this illegal state authority. So it's saying that Congress decided that the governments that were in the states after session were illegal. And because they were illegal, the government needed to take them over. But then the government was taking over an illegal state and then running the illegal state illegally. It certainly would be a novel spectacle if Congress could attempt to carry on a legal state government by the agency of its own officers. It is yet more strange that Congress attempts to sustain and carry on an illegal state government by the same federal agency. So it's saying that when the states ceded, the governments of those states that ceded became illegal. And so Congress came to take them over, and the fact that Congress took them over made them legal. And so he's asking here, he's saying, what kind of, logic is this? It doesn't make sense. Congress declares that these local state governments to be illegal governments, and then provides these illegal governments shall be carried on by federal officers. And when it says federal officers, it means military, and that's in some other stuff. The military, who are to perform the very duties imposed on its own officers by this illegal state authority. It certainly would be a novel spectacle if Congress should attempt to carry on a legal state government by the agency of its own officers. It is yet more strange that Congress attempts to sustain and carry on an illegal state government by the same federal agency. Okay. And here's a bill. S7, 40th Congress, first session. You can find most of these at loc.gov. March 6, 1867. Okay, so this is during the Civil War, and it's talking about to guarantee a Republican form of government in these states. Now, the problem with Lincoln is that he did not want to stay on the federal lands. He did not want the military to stay on the federal lands. He basically wanted to take over the entire states and their governments, and he has, and he did, and they still do. So these actually are in operation illegal state governments because they're not acting in according to the dictates of the Constitution. So when these states ceded, Lincoln came in with the military and took over the entire state. The Constitution declares clearly, it writes clearly, there's no question about it. Once you understand the words being used, it is absolutely clear that the federal government was given some small portions of land to set up military forts. And that is all. And it was for the protection of the entire nation. Okay, but they were supposed to stay on the forts. They weren't even allowed to come off the forts or posts for purposes of going to the doctor's office, because it was called an island in a nation, or an island in the state, which means sort of like a nation within a nation. And that's defined also. An island is defined as a nation within a nation in a legal sense. And so they had their own naturalization laws to become citizens of the federal government on those federal lands. And that's written in the jurisdiction report that I talk about. So Lincoln doesn't want the states to leave the Union because, remember, his whole purpose, he didn't care about the slaves. He wanted to keep the Union together so that he could expand the jurisdiction of the federal government and take over the entire state. He didn't want to stay on the federal lands. So what he did was he took the military and he went and he took over the legislatures of the states, the lawfully created legislators of the people of the state. And that's also in a congressional report where Cowan is asking, and I'll read that here in a minute. So whereas in the years 1860 and 1861, the inhabitants of Virginia and all these other states changed their respective constitutions, which is their lawful right, so as to make them repugnant to the Constitution of the United States. So the United States is saying, well, we don't like it, because they were seceding from the Union. They were kicking out the United States. The United States is the federal lands that was created for forts. Okay, that's what it is. Okay, I have to clean my glasses off. And whereas the inhabitants of those states made war upon the United States. Okay, so they made war upon the United States because the United States was exceeding its jurisdiction. It was causing problems with creating the railroads and taking people's personal property, because The United States wasn't given the right to take property from people who already owned the property. I know people call this, you know, eminent domain, but they only had eminent domain on the federal lands. They can't just come off the federal lands and claim private property or claim state property. They have to go to the legislators of the state and offer to purchase the lands, and then the state has to get permission from the landowner. And if the landowner agrees, then okay. But if not, the state can't just go, the federal government can't just go to the state and start kicking people off and saying, we're taking your lands. But that's what they were doing with the railroads. So after many battles finally surrendered, because they had the military and they beat everybody up, under the rules and usages of war, and whereas the inhabitants of these states, so basically the federal government used the military to beat up the inhabitants, to the point that the inhabitants had no choice but to surrender. And so the federal government took over the states. And at the time of their surrender, were without legal state governments, because they took over the lawful governments created by the people. And so they were without one. And that's what this guy is saying. He's saying if their governments, the governments or states created by the inhabitants were illegal, how do you come over and take them over? And by the mere fact that you took them over, now they're legal. Okay, it doesn't work that way, especially not in America, where sovereignty comes from the people. So it comes from the people and it goes to the state, and then the states create the feds, and the feds create the military on the federal posts for fortifications. And they are supposed to do this for protecting the people, but then they waged war against the people and took over all their lands. And they did it dishonestly, because the only way they could do it was to purchase the lands. Well, they didn't purchase the lands. They did it dishonestly, and they just took them over. And they said, well, because you're warring with us and we want to free the slaves, when Lincoln said he didn't give a shit about the slaves. As a rebel population were without authority from legal state governments or to exercise any other political functions belonging to loyal citizens, and they must so continue until relieved. So Lincoln wanted to make everyone a citizen of the United States. Okay, this is the problem we're having. He wants everyone to be a citizen of the United States, which makes them all employees of the federal government. Okay, so when you go to Title V and you go to organization and employees of federal government, or federal government organization and employees, they are citizens of the United States. In the Constitution, it says senators, representatives, and the presidents have to become citizens of the United States, meaning they have to get naturalized, go onto the federal lands, and live and work on the federal lands for that number of years, and then they can run for office at the seat of government. Judges do not have to be citizens of the United States. So obviously, there's some people who are citizens and some people who are not. Well, Lincoln wants everyone to be a loyal citizen. Okay, so he's basically throwing out the Constitution. He's using it for what he wants to use it for, and then throwing everything else out. And Lincoln and Rockefeller, I believe, were working together, because Rockefeller, if you don't know about Rockefeller, has created the entire banking and medical monopoly. A republic is against any kind of monopoly. It's a commonwealth, which means everyone has a common right to do what they need to do. So if there's a monopoly, it's not in common, because one person is running something and nobody else can get in on that kind of action, because it's a monopoly. A republic is protection of everyone's rights equally. So the functions belonging to loyal citizens, and they must so continue until relieved of such disabilities by the lawmaking power of the United States. So the United States never had lawmaking power over the entire country. only over the federal areas. So I'm looking for, okay, so this is a congressional record. Here's a small copy of it. It's probably hard to see, but here we go. Here's a bigger copy of it. And then I enlarged it on the side for purposes of being able to see it on your screen. So I'm gonna zoom out just for a minute. This is 1867, the Congressional Globe, page 1565. I also have written this in a PDF. But I'll just read from here. So this is Mr. Cowan speaking. And Mr. Cowan asks the president, and we're going to skip down to here. Why, Mr. President, what is a legal state government? Is it a state government cooked up for a state here in Congress? Or is it a government that the people of the state make for themselves? I like a plain answer to a plain question. We made these state governments? Question mark. The state government of Louisiana was made by the people of Louisiana under a proclamation issued by Mr. Lincoln referring that question to them. The question then arose between Mr. Lincoln and the senator from Massachusetts and others of his school as to whom the question should be referred to as people, or in other words, who are the people. Radical gentlemen said that the people are all persons, black and white, all together. Mr. Lincoln, however, in consulting the lawyers, was informed that the word people had two significations. That in its general and ordinary signification, it did mean everybody, whites and blacks, but that in its technical or political meaning, it meant the people of a state who were entrusted with the political power of the state. And by what law? By the law of the state. There is no other law fixing who this technical class of persons are anywhere existing, not even the ingenuity of those who invent so many things has ever, so far as I know, discovered any law anywhere except upon the statute books of a state discovered who the people were to whom this question should be referred. Okay, I can read. That's the last sentence I can read. Okay, so he's asking the president, what's a legal state? You know, why do we have these legal states? Is it a state cooked up by the men in Congress? Because that's a different state. Is it a state made lawfully by the people who actually live in the state? So the states are actually made historically and lawfully by the population of people in that state, the settlers and inhabitants. But when government comes in and takes over, then they create a legal state. And so he's asking, what is this state? Okay, what is this? Who are these people making these states? Is it these people here in Congress? Because then we have a legal state. Or is it the people, the settlers and inhabitants who created a state for themselves, a lawful state? Okay, this is Journal of the, I'm going to say of the Senate, but it may be House. House. Let's say it's the House because this is a House bill. February 19th, 1867, page 422. Whereas no legal state governments or adequate protection for life and property now exist in the rebel states of, okay, so when it talks about adequate protection for life and property now exist in the rebel states, it's because the federal government and the federal constitution was the creation of a military for putting military forts on certain federal lands inside the states that were annexed to the federal government. And that was their sole purpose, protect life and property. That does not mean that the states can't do it themselves. That just meant that the states agreed to go into this sort of league of friendship with all the other states and allow the federal government to set up a system, a military system, where the president would be commander-in-chief. Now, after you listen to this video, go back and listen to Ed Rivera's video again on his paper that I read, because he's basically saying that the government and the way it was set up with the Articles of Confederation, how they were never repealed. I've talked about that for a while now. There's no repealing clause. So the president of the United States of America also became the commander-in-chief. Okay, and that's in the Constitution, where it says the president shall be commander-in-chief, and he shall also be the executive of the states. Okay, and then they list the states. And whereas it is necessary that peace and good order should be enforced in said states. Okay, it wasn't there. They were never put in the states. The federal government was never put in the states to force people into a state of peace and good order. They were only supposed to do that domestically, and domestically meant on their lands, because that was the only place they had jurisdiction, which is power and authority. They were never given power and authority off federal lands. As a matter of fact, when they made contracts with the states, and the states gave them certain lands, the states had to agree to allow the government to be the only ones to make laws for those lands. And doing so meant that the state retained all rights, all sovereignty, all lawmaking authority off the federal lands. So if I have to come ask you if I can set laws up for a room in your house, and you say yes, that means you automatically are retaining all the rights to the rest of the house. If I have to ask you permission for a small portion, that doesn't give me jurisdiction over all. Okay? I can come over and bring friends over for the day to use the pool, and after that it's over. That doesn't mean I go in your house and start cooking up food and, go in your bedroom and take a nap. No, that means I have the backyard, and that's it. So the federal government was like sort of given the backyard, small part of the backyard, and they weren't allowed to come in the house. And they're saying, well, we want to come in the house, and if you don't let us come in the house, we're just going to use the military and we're just going to take the house. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that said rebel states shall be divided into military districts. The military has no law enforcement authority. It cannot come off the federal lands and force people to follow federal laws. Into military districts and made subject to the military. So it's saying that it's going to put the military off military lands, off federal lands, and force people to be subject to it, where the military has no sovereignty. The military has absolutely zero sovereignty. It has no lawmaking authority. It has no law enforcement authority. That's why you don't see cops dressed in military uniforms. They have an entirely different uniform. They're not even constitutional. So the fact that a cop has to take an oath to defend the Constitution means that a cop cannot actually enforce policy, because if you're going to do one or the other. If you have an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, policy goes against the Constitution and you're enforcing policy, then you're not upholding your oath. The said rebel states shall be divided into military districts and made subject to the military authority of the United States as hereinafter prescribed, and for that purpose Virginia shall constitute the first district, and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, let's go back to what this other guy said. Congress declares these local state governments to be illegal governments, and then provides that these illegal governments shall be made legal by the federal government, because the federal government's the one that's going to carry it out. It certainly would be a novel spectacle if Congress should attempt to carry on a legal state government by the agency of its own military officers, It is yet more strange that Congress attempts to sustain and carry on an illegal state government by the same federal agency. So I find it just very interesting. So there's a lot of other stuff written on the legal state government and the legal state and taking over the legal states using the military. So I don't want to go into it too much. I think just pointing it out is pretty good. Let's see, this is what I'm trying to bring up here. I don't know if you can see it, but when it talks about district, a territory or place of jurisdiction. Okay, and I've showed you guys the definition of jurisdiction is power or authority to do a thing. So this is saying that a district is a territory or a place of jurisdiction. So when it says the District of Columbia, that's the place where the federal government has authority to do a thing. So when it sets military in the state, the military area is a military district. That does not mean that they can come off the federal lands. Okay, this is sort of their expansion of jurisdiction. Everybody wants more power. No one wants to be limited to their house. I want to come over to your house and I want to see what you got. And I want to see what you're doing over here. And then I'm going to see if I can wiggle my way in. Now, I've got kids, and that's what they do. They do it all the time. They try to see what they can get out of me. They try to see what they can get me to do for them instead of them doing what they're supposed to do. Kids are especially bad at this. Grown men who act like kids? That's way worse. So it wanted to take possession. The federal government wanted to take possession of the entire state, of areas that it doesn't actually have jurisdiction over. So in Latin, in the civil law, that condition of fact under which one can exercise his power over a corporeal thing, corporeal means like a body, thing at his pleasure to the exclusion of all others. This condition of fact is called detention. Okay, and it forms the substance of possession in all its varieties. Possession, in the sense of detention, is the actual exercise of such power over as the owner has a right to exercise. So when you're talking about lands, let's talk about kids, in CPS. The government wants to take over the power we have over our children by using these various state/federal agencies. So they want to take possession, and they do it by detention, by putting us under some sort of other law. They detain us. They detain our kids. They detain our rights. Okay, the term possessio occurs in the Roman jurist in various senses. There is possessio simply and possessio civilis and possessio naturalis. Possessio denoted originally bare detention. But this detention under certain conditions becomes a legal state. Okay, and that's what this is. It's in as much as it leads to ownership through usucapio. Accordingly, the word possessio, which required no qualification as so long as there was no other notion attached to possessio, requires such qualifications when detention becomes a legal state. So the federal government comes off federal lands and then they claim to possess all the lands. They possess it through detention or they detain it. And because they've detained it, they claim that they now possess it. This detention then, when it has the conditions necessary to usucapio, is called possessio civilis. And all other possessio, as opposed to civilis, is naturalis. Okay, so you have natural possession and you have civil possession. Natural possession would be the lawful state created by the people who are actually in the state, the settlers and inhabitants, which would be us regular people, us people not in the government and not in the military. Okay, why, Mr. President? What is a legal state government? Is it a government cooked up for a state here in Congress? So is it a government that took possession of the states through detention because the people were fighting in the Civil War? Or is it a government that the people of the state make for themselves? That would be a lawful government. Okay, so it says here, the adjective lucrativa denoted that property was acquired by this usucapio without any consideration or payment for it, which is what they did, because in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, the only way the federal government can obtain property is through the purchase of it. That's why they put that in there, because any other way would be improba, which is dishonest. So let me finish reading this. Okay, so this is an English-Latin dictionary now. All of English comes from other languages. So don't even get me started on, well, that's Latin and that's French and that's this and that's that, okay? So let's see, this is without any consideration or payment for it by way of purchase, and as the possessor who so acquired the property was a malified possessor, his acquisition or usucapio was called also improba or dishonest. Okay, and then they're talking about the history of, I think, Rome, or it could be Italy, probably Rome. Most of these, yeah, go back to Rome, Roman law, luctus in Roman law. Okay, so when you obtain land properly, the federal government can obtain it by purchasing it, but according to the Constitution, purchase it for forts. Now, that's why they say that one of the reasons why they say this, the things in the Constitution limits the federal government. That is the extent of the thing they can do. They can only purchase property for forts. Now they say, well, it doesn't say we can't purchase property in other ways or for other purposes, or we can't just acquire it. Like there's a lot of Rockefeller trading lands with the federal government or selling lands to the federal government and then giving the federal government jurisdiction over those lands, which is called proprietorial interest, which means they have no more right than you and I do. Of course, the federal government doesn't regulate itself the way it regulates us, so it does pretty much whatever it wants. So the federal government is allowed to purchase lands for forts. It cannot purchase or acquire lands for any other purposes because it's not in the Constitution. Okay, so these banks, these IRS offices, these federal buildings and all that stuff, the only way they were able to do that is by taking over the entire state and instituting its own illegal governments, calling them legal and calling the state legal. So whatever lawful government was in the states that's created by the people, the government comes in because Lincoln was just crooked. He comes in, he says, you're an illegal government, we have to take you over. So just the fact that the federal government takes it over, they claim makes it legal. But it's actually backwards. People make things legal when they comply with what's according to law. And Lincoln didn't do it according to law because he can only purchase lands for forts. So he came in and he said, well, we're just going to take over. And that was dishonest because he didn't purchase the lands. So he detained people and he detained the lands and he detained the state and took them over. He called their states illegal, took them over, and the mere fact that he took them over, then he called them legal. Okay, so real dishonest, wrong, against the Constitution, illegal. This is Bouvier's Law Dictionary, a concise encyclopedia of the law. When an enemy's military occupation comes to an end, the legal state of things previously existing is deemed to have been in continuous existence during the occupation. So once the people take back over the states, that military legal state ends, and then they can erect their own legal states that are in accordance to the law, and then are lawful state governments because they belong to us. Now, in a YouTube video, I want to say last week, I know most of you have probably watched The Mandalorian. If you haven't, The Mandalorian is a soldier, and I don't really know the whole history, the background of Mandalorian, but he's a soldier, and he's given the responsibility of taking care of what they call the kid, which is a child. He's 50 years old, but he's still a child. He's that, little short, wrinkly, weird looking dude with the, the powers. Yoda. Yoda, my daughter says. And whenever he's so exasperated by having to carry this kid around everywhere, he's reminded that this is the way. This is the right thing to do. This is the way things are supposed to be. So, I forgot where I was going with this. Oh, so Daniel McAdams was talking about how there was a school board and they were requiring children to wear masks, and the parents got fed up with it. So they went in and they just stood their ground until the entire school board resigned. And then they re-elected new officers, and the first thing they did was remove the mask mandate. And Daniel McAdams on the Ron Paul Institute on the Liberty Channel says, this is the way. And that's what the Mandalorian is reminded of. This is the way. This is the right thing to do, the way it's supposed to be. You take it over, and then you make it lawful. You make it according to the law, because what the government's doing now is they're acting outside of the law. They call it legal, but they call it legal because it's man-made, but it's a fiction because it's not in accordance to the law. Okay. Let's see. So what else have they been doing? Okay, so they've been doing some other stuff since 1867, some other bad stuff to us. So let's look at what they've been doing. Oh, I've got to find it now. Here it is. Thankfully, it's right here. Okay, so if you don't understand what the state of and then your state name is, that is the legal state that Lincoln put into our states. When he took it over using military force, they created this state of, okay, the one that Mr. Cowan's talking about, a legal state government, cooked up by the people in Congress. Okay. And part of that legal state government is like the state of Texas, and they have legal papers. So these legal papers are a legal document. This one is for a birth certificate. Okay, and it creates a legal name. Okay, but this is the parent's legal name. This is down here, the child's legal name. Child's legal name. Okay, for the state of Texas. Now, if you want a legal name, that's fine, but you should have a legal name for Texas, not state of Texas, because Texas is the lawful government, controlled by the settlers and inhabitants of Texas or whatever state you're in. Now, when you have a legal name for the state of Texas, now you're a taxpayer. Now you're subject to the draft. You have to get a driver's license, a social security card, all these things. Okay? That's where the problem is. That's how this happened. Okay, so then they make it a record and all this stuff. Now, originally, when you wanted to become a citizen of the United States or a federal citizen, you had to go to one of the courts created by the federal government or the state or a district or whatever's in the naturalization law, and you had to apply in a court of record. And when you applied in a court of record, you became a federal citizen. And then you went and you lived and worked on federal lands. And you stayed there. But in my video on jurisdiction over federal areas within the state, the first video, I explain a lot of this, and it goes along with this video. So this video is like how we got there. And what they did was they... the federal citizens on the federal lands, you know, back then in early 1800s, they didn't have a lot, but they didn't need a lot because wives just stayed home with the kids. They homeschooled the kids. They had their babies in the home. The doctor came to the home. But as off federal lands, the state and the state people, who were called the private citizens, were building hospitals and building all these schools and insane asylums and fire departments and police departments for themselves. The federal people got jealous and they wanted to use those, but they didn't pay state taxes. They only paid federal taxes, and those were originally the federal taxpayers. So they wanted to come off the federal lands and use our services, and the local state court said no. And then the Supreme Court of the state said no, because they were no longer state citizens, because they lost their citizenship with the state when they went to the federal government and started working for the federal government and became, remember I said those areas, those annexed areas for federal purposes, which were forts for defense, were called islands. And islands in some places are defined as a nation within a nation. So they became nationals of the federal government, the United States, that federal government called the United States. And they lived there, they worked there, they stayed on those lands. That doesn't mean they couldn't come off, but like nowadays, they would have to have a passport. If they wanted to drive on our roads, they would have to have a state of Texas driver's license, not us, them, because they have to show that they are paying the tax to drive on the roads, because they weren't state citizens, they weren't taxpayers. So they were required to get a state of Texas driver's license. They were required to get a state of Texas birth certificate showing that they were born on the federal lands in the state. So when they wanted to come off the federal lands and couldn't, and then they sued in 2 courts and they still lost, the federal government had to make contracts with the state to create a new citizenship for these federal citizens, and that's where you get the 14th Amendment. This 14th Amendment allowed for blacks and whites, because the federal government couldn't practice prejudice, especially after it fought a civil war against racism and slavery. So it acknowledged that both have to be treated equally, and both could be citizens, federal citizens as well as state citizens. That would allow if there were a black person who wanted to become a federal citizen, a federal officer, and work on the federal lands, the state couldn't say no. And if there were a black citizen on the federal lands and he wanted to come off onto the lands on the state, he couldn't be told no by the state. he had to be treated the same by the state. So he had to be able to come, and his family had to be able to come off. So their kids would have to be able to also go to the public schools in the state, because the contracts between the state and the federal government that were created to allow federal citizens to use state services such as the hospitals, the roads, the schools, the fire departments, the police departments, the insane asylums. The Black people had to be able to be treated equally, and they had to be able to become citizens of the state as well as federal citizens. Okay, so when the Black people on post needed to have their children go to the schools, the states had a problem with it, but there were already contracts set in place. So the states didn't have a right to say no, and that's why they used military force, which they actually can't use military force against the civilians of the state. They can only protect the federal citizens and their dependents. So when these kids back in, let's say, 1790, 1795, when all these officers started becoming federal officers, these people on the federal land started becoming federal citizens, they had their families there. Some of their kids would be born in their homes, and then they would become born. They would become a citizen of the United States born. Okay? So once they were 21, these dependent children who were citizens of the United States and had a birth certificate stating that they were a citizen of the federal government, after they were 21 and had so many years as a citizen, they could become a senator or representative or president. So I forget exactly what the ages are, so I'll skip that. I think it's 21 or 26, something like that. Okay, now senators had to have more years, had to have 9 years as citizenship, because they were, the word senator means senior. There were seniors. There were senior officers. Okay, so this is VS-109.1, revised 8/2016, if you want to look it up. There may be a new one. I have always had a hard time finding these online, but you just have to dig around and dig around and dig around, and you'll find them. So this number may be no good anymore if they've revised it. I don't know if maybe they keep the number and then they just change the date. But VS means vital statistics. So what they do is they send these records, these certificates, these records of births, and they record them. Okay, and what do you do when you want to become a federal citizen according to the naturalization laws? You go to a court of record and you apply. You apply to become a citizen of the United States. Okay, so here's the key. If I make this smaller, you won't be able to see anything. Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Defense, Fish and Wildlife. So Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife, Forest and National Services are not constitutional areas. Department of Defense are constitutional areas for defense purposes. So they have exclusive legislative jurisdiction over all these purple areas, or blue, whatever color that is. Okay, Fort Hood, Randolph Air Force Base, Fort Sam Houston, Brooks Air Force Base, Lackland Air Force Base, Camp Swift. I think there's a few over here. Everything else is not really constitutional because they're not for forts. They're for parks and stuff. And this is from nationalatlas.gov, and they have taken that website down. And it's just no longer up anymore. So last time I went there, it said something like, this website has expired. I don't know how government websites expire, but apparently there was some sort of expiration date. And I'm going to go through here just real quick, see if there's a few other things. And I've told you in some of my other videos that the Constitution was for military purposes. Okay, this is an encyclopedia I found. I have the whole page somewhere. Section XI. Let me see, maybe this is it. Nope. Nope, that's just the same thing. So it's section 13 of the Military and Maritime States. This would be the federal lands for forts. Okay, the military state by the standing constitutional law. Okay, the military state, the federal areas in the state. By the standing constitutional law, the Constitution of the United States for the United States of America, consist of the militia of each country, which would be the states here, consist of the militia of the states because the states are supposed to have control of the militia. The militia comprises the private citizens raised from among the people by lot, the people of the state, okay? Officered by the principal landholders. The landholders in this country, where the officers are, is the federal government, and they own certain lands in the state for forts, and commanded by the Lord Lieutenant. The Lord Lieutenant in our country would be the president, who is the commander-in-chief under Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Land and Naval Forces, not the United States of America. He is the executive officer of the United States of America. See if I have this on my desktop somewhere. I don't see it. But I think you're getting the idea here. I think you're starting to understand what I'm saying. Okay, I think there was one other thing. So I think, let's see, enrolling, registering, reporting, all has to do with, oh, I remember, the birth certificate and certain words being used. So the sovereign commands the military. The military is subject to the dictates of the sovereign. So this is in law. I think this is Peel's dictionary or encyclopedia. The evil is called sanction. No, a command is an order issued by a sovereign to an inferior. Okay, also an inferior would be a subject to the sovereign. A command is an order issued by a superior who is a sovereign, issued to an inferior, which is a subject, or a superior to an inferior, so military. When you're issued commands, you use certain words, and those words are imperatives. In grammar, they're called imperatives, and they are shall, must, and will. Before you fill out the birth certificate, you are not an inferior, you are a superior. So they come and they ask you, they're supposed to ask you, because when you're not inferior to them, you're superior to them, they say, can you, may you, will you? And you can go back and watch my video on the pastor in Canada. He says he's a church member, and he's defending his church and his right for his people to come to the church and get together and not wear masks. And if you notice in the video, when the lady comes to give him the paper, she's asking, she says, will you, can you, if you could read here, if I may show you this, because she knows that she is actually inferior to him, so she's asking him. Okay, so once he accepts and he becomes a member through his application or his reporting of himself, and then and his reports or his enrollment of himself or his enlistment in the military, once he does those things, he becomes an inferior and becomes subject to the commands. And when they start commanding you, they say shall, will, must. So so this is law. I think this is in Peel's Encyclopedic Dictionary. No, not Encyclopedic Dictionary, Encyclopedia Britannica. And it's 1893, I think. Okay, so you have to distinguish between whether they're asking you or whether they're telling you. But once you sign the papers, they don't have to ask you anymore because you've made yourself an inferior. Now they're just going to tell you. They're going to tell you this is how it is. Okay, so that's my video for today, or at least on this topic. I hope you learned something. I hope that you will share this information. Like my channel, subscribe to my channel, make some comments, and we can talk about all these things. And there's other people that will occasionally make comments on my videos, and they like to talk and talk about different things and bring up different topics. And all I ask is that we all just be considerate of each other. We all have different opinions about reality these days. We all have a different idea about what's true and what's not true. And so I just ask that we be kind and have kind conversations with each other while we just try to figure out our own truth. Okay, and you guys have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.